Following on from the Second World War, the Victorian Railways was interested in totally recuperating the railway system after roughly 2 decades of decay, economic depression and war. Since the 1930s, Victorian Railways had been on the downward slope. The Great Depression hit them hard, and in the 1940s, the Second World War hit even harder. To meet the needs of the post-war world and rebuild the Victorian Railways network after the Second World War, the Victorian Railways launched Operation Phoenix. It was predicted that the VR would face total collapse and destruction if it did not shape up. In 1914, the Victorian Railways was to be looked at closely, and the report was commissioned by Transport Minister Kent Hughes. It was carried out by British Railways Chief Executive John Elliott, who predicted a breakdown of rail transport unless something was done to address the rundown railway. Among the many hundreds of improvements that were made by the Victorian Railways, including the introduction of the R and J-Class steam locomotives, new builds of the N-Class, and a brand new design of diesel rail motors, the Victorian Railways also sought to introduce diesel-electric traction onto the network. It's a story we've all heard before. As the B-Class was introduced in 1952, they were widely successful, versatile and highly efficient machines, and the steam locomotives began to disappear. The first order for 25 B-Class locomotives was carried out in a mere 2 years, as the VR rushed to implement the B-Class onto the network. However, although widespread and could be practically used on all Victorian lines, bar the lightest, the V-Class were mainline locomotives through and through, and the VR branch lines and secondary routes were still festooned with steam locomotives. Following on from the B-Class, the T-Class were conceived as branch line locomotives. Compared to later Victorian Railways diesel locomotives, the T-Class was smaller and lighter, while still not being as light as the Y-Class, F-Class and M-Class diesels. The T-Class were meant to replace the Y, A2, E and D3 steam locomotives, and as a competitor for these classes, the T was a worthy adversary. The first order of T-Class was placed in July 1954, and the class leader, T320, emerged from Clyde workshops on the 3rd of the 8th, 1955. The first order of T-classes were characterised by their distinctive flat-top roofs, seen here. As you could imagine, the flat-top T-classes were very cramped for their crews, clearly favouring the shorter of stature crews. Although identical mechanically, the second series T-Class differed significantly in appearance from the first series, having a raised cab for the crew. This second order commenced in June 1959, and all 11 were in service by December that same year. The third order of T-Classes, again with high cabs, commenced in December 1962 and was completed in May 1962, tallying 10 locomotives. The fourth order saw the introduction of the low nose, the third series, drastically improving visibility and comfort for the crew, and totally changing the aesthetic of the T-Class. These locomotives entered service in February 1964, and all 31 were in service by December 1966, making this the most numerous order since the initial 27 first series. The fifth and final order saw another interesting addition to the T-Class lineage. The first 14 locomotives entered service in April 1967, and the order was completed by November 1968. But then, in December 1968, another 5 T-classes were added to the 5th order. These became the H-Class, based entirely on the underpinnings of the T-Class, was a modified variant. It was given a manual power control, which allowed the H-Class to reach precise low speeds, perfect for the intended task of shunting the hump in Melbourne freight yards. It was also fitted with a special and very precise speedometer, and an extra 10 tons of weight added for extra adhesion, warranting it to be classified as the H-Class. If you like, consider it the TH class, as in the T heavy class. T-Class was based on the EMD G8 locomotive, an American design. They were intended for use abroad and in the USA. The first engine fitted to the T-Class was the EMD 567C 8-cylinder engine. In the T-Class, it could output 875 brake horsepower. It also had a tractive effort of 28,000 pounds. The T-Class was capable of around 60 miles per hour, and to us metric addicts, 100 kilometers per hour, and weighed in at about 68 tons. All T-Classes were built by the New South Wales plant Clyde Engineering. From T399 onwards, essentially the fifth order, were fitted with newer and more modern EMD 645 prime movers, making the fifth order locomotives more powerful with 950 horsepower and a greater tractive effort. The H-Class 2 would be fitted with the EMD 645 engine. In service, they were very dependable machines, working across the entirety of the Victorian Railways network. They could be seen from Mildura to Bairnsdale and everywhere in between. Of course, being on the smaller end of the VR fleet, they were more suited to branch line trains, but they were never limited to branch lines. They were also found on the main lines, pulling intermediate passenger trains, stopping trains, and suburban trains, as well as a very healthy mix of freight operations. They could mostly be seen riding behind a bigger locomotive as extra power. By the 1980s, the VR reformed into V-Line, another interesting development for the T-Class lineage. The ageing first series, i.e. the first order with flat roofs, were obviously the oldest of the lot. V-Line was modernising its passenger capacities by replacing old wooden-bodied coaches and older steel-bodied coaches with new steel-bodied coaches. As a part of this renewed passenger effort, the G, N and A classes were introduced, or, in the A class's case, rebuilt from the B class. Clyde Engineering in New South Wales completely overhauled 13 of the first series T class and became the P class, commencing in 1984 and finished by 1985. They were fitted with a new engine, the EMD 645E. This drastically extended the lifespan of the converted 13 locomotives, some of which are still in service today. By the time all 13 of the first series T classes were converted to P classes, the year was 1985, and the withdrawal of the T class began, as branch lines, freight traffic and a declining passenger base saw the need for 94 locomotives dry up. The first withdrawal for a T class, when it wasn't going to be converted into a P class, was in mid-1986, with the last withdrawn from service with V-Line by 1992. A few 5th and 4th order engines remained with Freight Victoria, and later to either be stored or scrapped by Pacific National. In total, the disposition of the remaining T classes are like this, and if I have my numbers wrong, please correct me in the comments. Here we go. 36 T classes were scrapped. 14 are preserved, both operational and stored. 13 were converted to P classes, and 5 were converted to H classes. 4 are being used in an incredibly sad manner by Bob White Electrics, probably as diesel generators. I mean, look at them. It's horrible. I hope one day that they're preserved properly. There are 4 T classes still in service and can be seen pulling mainline Southern short-haul railroad trains. There are 4 still in service with Rail First. 6 were sold to Australia National Railways, where their fates are unknown to me, and 3 are probably stored with Pacific National. And I do believe there is one somewhere, it could be in Geelong, still in service with Pacific National today. Of the P classes, 13 are still intact, in perfect operating condition, with 7 being used regularly by SSR and 6 preserved and stored. And lastly, the H-Class. One was scrapped in 2020, but overall the other 4 are still operational. If these numbers are wrong, please feel free to tell me, and punish me in the comments by commenting as hurtfully as you can. In short, the T-Class was a highly successful design, which, from the 1950s up until the modern day, serve whoever owns them well. With many examples preserved and still operational, we are truly blessed to be able to be seeing them working on the main lines today. I'm Charles, and thank you for watching. Hold it. And please don't forget to subscribe. It really does help. It's a great morale boost.
Old Oliver Cromwell goes by. Did you fancy your hand at the throttle and brake with a steam driven into your soul? Or to stand with the driving wheels under your feet and shovel a mountain of coal? Well, they've silenced the whistle, the coal is all burned, they've buried the ashes for good. They've torn up the loop, and there's only a scar to show where the water drain stood. But the birch and the elder still follow the track, standing black.